Settle in for this one. Let the day get quiet around you. Pull the blanket up. And let me tell you a story that happened in a small church in the middle of Nebraska on a cold, gray morning in early spring. And the woman it happened to was the pastor, and her name was Rachel. Rachel was 34 years old, and she was 11 weeks into the first congregation she had ever led on her own. If you have never stood at the front of a small country church as its brand new pastor, let me tell you what those first weeks feel like. They feel like being handed a house full of other people's memories and being asked to keep it warm. Everyone in the pews had known each other for 50 years. They had buried each other's parents and married each other's children, and knew the whole long history of every quarrel and kindness in that town. And Rachel knew none of it. She was the outsider with the title, learning 100 years of story, 11 weeks at a time. And she wanted so badly, the way you do at the start of a thing, to be accepted. Rachel had come to it late, this calling. She had spent her 20s doing something else entirely, working in a hospital in a city 300 miles away, sitting with the dying because somebody had to, and she had found that she could. And somewhere in all those late, quiet rooms, she had heard, plain and undeniable, the thing that eventually sends a person to seminary at an age when her friends were buying their second houses. She had wanted a small church. She had asked for one. She had pictured, honestly, something gentler than what she got. A place where being kind and being present would be enough, where she would not have to be brave, only warm. What she had not counted on was how a small town holds its shape, how much older and heavier its habits are than any one new pastor with good intentions. She had arrived thinking she might change the place a little, the way the young always think. She had not yet learned that a town like that changes you first, sands you down, teaches you its long grammar of grudges and loyalties before it will let you move a single thing. 11 weeks in, she still felt the doors of it politely closed to her, and she was hungry, in a way she was not entirely proud of, to finally be let inside. The town was small. It was one of those places out on the plains that you would miss if you sneezed. A grain elevator, a gas station, a diner that closed at 2, a handful of streets, and all around it the enormous flat patient farmland, running out to a horizon so wide it made the sky feel like the main event. Everybody knew everybody. That is a beautiful thing, and it is a hard thing, and it is both for the very same reason, which is that in a town that size, nobody is ever really a stranger, and nobody is ever quite allowed to become something new. You are who the town decided you were, and the town has a long, long memory. Which brings us to the man at the end of the county road. His name was Walt, and Rachel had never met him, and now she never would, because on a Tuesday in March, a neighbor noticed his mailbox had not been emptied in 3 days, and that was how they found him, gone quietly in his sleep in the small house he had lived in alone for longer than Rachel had been alive. Rachel drove out to the end of the county road once, before the funeral, though she could not have told you exactly why. She told herself it was to see whether there was anything in the house she would need for the service, but really, she wanted to stand where he had stood. The road ran straight out of town and then turned to gravel and then to 2 dirt tracks with grass grown up the middle, and it ended at a small plain house behind a windbreak of old cottonwoods, the curtains drawn just as the town had always said. It was tidy. That surprised her. A neatly kept woodpile, a garden gone to sleep for the winter, but clearly tended in its season. A porch swept clean. It was not the lair the town's story had led her to imagine, It was the careful, orderly home of a man who had a great deal of time and nobody at all to spend it on. She stood in the yard in the cold wind coming off the fields, and she looked at that swept porch and those drawn curtains, and she felt the first crack open in the story she had been handed. Whatever else Walt was, he was not careless, and he was not wild, and he did not seem, standing in the quiet of his kept yard, like a man anyone should ever have been afraid of. He seemed like a man who had built a very small, very orderly world and pulled it shut around himself. And Rachel, who had sat with a great many people at the ends of their lives, knew that people only do that for one reason. They do it when the larger world has hurt them past the point of ever trying it again. Rachel learned about Walt the way she learned about everything in those early weeks, in pieces, from the way people said his name. And the way people said his name told her, before she ever heard a single fact, that Walt was not one of the town's own. There was a tightening when he came up, a glance exchanged. Oh, him. The man at the end of the county road. They did not say anything cruel exactly. It was quieter and older than cruelty. It was the particular chill a small town saves for the one person it has agreed over many decades not to know. She heard the fragments. He kept to himself. He never came to church, never came to a potluck, never sat on a committee or coached a team or ran for anything. He had lived out there alone as far back as anyone could remember, in a house with the curtains always drawn. And he did not wave when he drove through town. And mothers, long ago, without ever quite deciding to, had learned to steer their children a little wide of his place. Why? Nobody could exactly say. That was the strangest part when Rachel pressed gently, the way a new pastor learns to press. Nobody could tell her what Walt had ever actually done. There was no crime, no scandal anyone could name, no story with an ending. There was only the long habit of a town that had decided, sometime back in the fog of decades, that the quiet man at the end of the road was someone to keep at the edge of things, and had never once revisited the decision. The funeral fell to Rachel because there was no one else. Walt had no family that anyone knew of, but the funeral director, a gentle older man named Owen, who had buried half the county, came to Rachel with his hat in his hands and told her that Walt had, in fact, left one instruction, written in a careful, old-fashioned hand and kept with his few papers. He wanted his service held at that church, Rachel's church, the one he had never once, in all those decades, walked into. And so Rachel said yes, of course, the way pastors do. And then she went to plan a funeral for a man she had never met, in a town that had spent 50 years agreeing he did not belong to them. And she ran, almost immediately, into the wall. It started with the ladies' committee. Now, I want to be careful here because this is a warm story and there is no villain in it. And the ladies' committee were not villains. They were a group of women in their 60s and 70s who had among them cooked for every wedding and every funeral in that church for 40 years, who ran the whole quiet machinery of comfort that a small congregation lives on. Their leader was a woman named Marjorie, sharp and kind and set in her ways in equal measure. And when Rachel asked about the reception, the coffee and the ham sandwiches and the sheet cake that follow every country funeral as surely as the amen, Marjorie was quiet for a moment, and then she said, gently, "Well, Pastor, I am not sure anyone would come, and I am not sure we ought to go to the trouble. For him. For him." Rachel heard the whole town in those two words. And it was not only Marjorie. Over the next few days, in the soft, indirect way of small places, the message reached Rachel from more than one direction. A word after service from the man whose family had farmed the biggest spread in the county for 3 generations. A phone call from another of the old, established families. Nobody was unkind. Everybody was reasonable. And the reasonable thing they were all so gently suggesting was this: keep it small, Pastor. Graveside only. A few words, out of Christian duty. And then let the man rest. And do not make the church go to any great length over someone who never gave this town the time of day. Keep it short. It is not as though anyone will be there. Rachel went home to the little parsonage that night, and she sat with it. And I want to tell you honestly that she was tempted. She was 11 weeks in. She needed this town. She could feel how easy it would be, how safe, to do the small graveside service everyone was quietly asking for, to nod along with the town's ancient verdict on the man at the end of the road, to not spend her thin new store of goodwill on a dead stranger who could not thank her and whom nobody wanted honored. That was the sensible path, and it was lit up bright in front of her, and she nearly took it. But something stopped her, and it was a small thing, and it is the hinge of the whole story. It was the instruction in that careful, old-fashioned hand. He wanted his service held at that church, the one he never entered. Rachel kept turning that over. Why would a man who stayed away from a church his entire life, who never sat in a single pew, ask to be carried into it at the very end? It did not fit the story the town told about Walt, the story of a cold man who wanted nothing to do with any of them. A cold man does not ask to come home to a place he never went. There was something the town's story did not account for, some whole shape hidden behind the drawn curtains at the end of the county road. And Rachel found that she could not, in good conscience, bury a question that large in a short graveside service in the cold. So she made her decision, and she made it quietly, and she did not argue with anyone about it, because she was learning that you do not win a 50-year-old town by arguing with it. She simply, gently went ahead. She would hold the full service. In the sanctuary, not at the graveside. With the good candles lit and the piano and the whole order of worship, the same as she would give the most beloved elder in the congregation. If nobody came, then nobody would come, and she would say the words anyway, to God and to an empty room, and to the memory of a man she never met, because that, she was beginning to understand, was the actual job. Not to honor the ones the town had already decided to honor. Anyone could do that. The job was to insist, when no one else would, that a life is a life. The morning of the funeral came gray and cold, with a thin wind coming off the fields that got into everything. Rachel arrived early to the empty church, and she did a small thing that she almost did not do. A small, hopeful, foolish thing. On the table by the door, where the programs always went, she set out a little stack of them. She had printed them herself. She stood there with the stack in her hand, and the honest part of her expected to need 2, maybe 3. Herself and Owen the funeral director, and perhaps a neighbor who felt an obligation. But she could not bring herself to set out only 3. It felt like agreeing with the town. So she counted out 9. 9 programs, fanned on the table by the door. An act of stubborn, quiet hope in an empty church on a cold morning. Then she went to the front to wait, and to say a prayer for a man she was beginning to wish, with a strange ache, that she had known. And this is the part of the story I have been wanting to tell you. So let it come slow. At 5 minutes to the hour, the heavy front door of the church opened, and the cold came in. And with it came a man Rachel did not recognize. He was old and weathered, with grease worn so deep into his hands that no washing would ever fully lift it. And he took off his cap at the door, the way men of a certain age do in a church. And he stood there a moment, uncertain. And then he took a program from the stack and went and sat down near the back, alone. Rachel had no idea who he was. She would learn, later, that his name was Hank, and that he had run the little repair garage in town for 40 years. She did not have long to wonder about him, because a minute later the door opened again. An older woman this time, in a good coat gone thin at the cuffs, moving slow with a cane. She took a program. She sat. And then the door opened again, and Rachel stood at the front of her church and watched, with a feeling she could not name climbing up through her chest, as the pews began, impossibly, quietly, to fill. They were not the town's important families. Rachel saw that right away. The big farmers and the old established names, the ones who had so gently suggested keeping it short, they were not there. The people coming through that door in ones and twos, shaking off the cold, taking a program with rough or trembling hands, were the other town, the quiet town, the one that lives underneath every small town and rarely gets counted. Working people, old people, a young family Rachel had never seen at service. The 9 programs were gone within minutes, and Rachel watched Owen slip quietly to the office to run more. And still they came, until the little sanctuary that had not been more than a third full on Rachel's best Sunday was full, all the way to the back, standing along the walls, on a cold Tuesday morning, for the man at the end of the county road. Rachel had prepared a short homily, the careful, generous words you say about a stranger. She got about 2 sentences into it before she understood that it was the wrong thing entirely, and she set her notes down on the pulpit, and she did the bravest thing a new pastor can do, which is to stop performing and simply ask a question. She looked out at that impossible, unexpected crowd, and she said, "I did not have the honor of knowing Walt, but it looks to me like many of you did. And I wonder if some of you might be willing to tell us how." There was a silence, the long, shy silence of country people. And then, near the back, old Hank the mechanic stood up, turning his cap around and around in his greasy hands, and he cleared his throat, and in a rough voice, unused to speaking in rooms, he told them this. He said that 11 years ago, the winter his wife was sick and the garage was failing, and he did not know how he was going to keep the heat on, an envelope had come, no name on it, with enough cash in it to cover the propane for the whole winter. And that it had come again the next winter, and the next. 11 winters in envelope, always in the coldest week, never a name. He had never known who. He had wondered his whole life. And then last week, he had heard that the man at the end of the county road had passed, and something, he did not know what, had told him to come today. And standing in the church, he said, looking around at the others, at the faces beginning to crumple all around that room, he thought maybe he finally knew. And then the widow with the cane stood up. Her name was Fay, and her voice shook, and she told about the spring after her husband died, when the roof of her old house failed and the rain was coming into her bedroom, and she had no money and no man and no idea what to do, and how one morning she woke to the sound of hammering, and there were shingles stacked in her yard, and by evening the roof was sound and dry and whole, and whoever had done it was gone, and had left no bill, and had never in all the years since let her thank him. One after another they stood. A woman whose medical bill had been quietly paid the year the mill closed. A man who as a boy had wanted to be the first in his family to go to college and could not afford the books, and had found them arriving semester after semester in plain, unmarked envelopes on the porch, all 4 years, and had grown up into the school teacher now standing in the third pew with tears running down his face. A man named Theo, who said he had built his entire life on a kindness he could never repay, because he had never known whose it was. Person after person, rope after rope of the same quiet thread, running all through that town for decades in secret, from the drawn curtains at the end of the county road. There was a young mother near the front, holding a sleeping baby against her shoulder, and she did not stand, but she spoke from her seat in a voice so soft the room had to lean in to catch it. She said she had not known Walt at all, that she was far too young, but that her grandmother, gone now, had told her once about the year the crops failed, and there had been, on their kitchen table one morning, a box of groceries that no one could ever account for, enough to carry 4 children through to the spring. She said she had come today because her grandmother had made her promise, if she ever found out who the man with the box had been, to go and say thank you on the family's behalf. She said, "I guess this is me keeping her promise." And she pressed a kiss to the top of her baby's head, and the whole church ached with it. And a strange and beautiful thing was happening as they spoke, which was that the people telling these stories were, most of them, hearing all the others for the very first time. They had each carried their own private envelope, their own quiet miracle, for years or for decades, never once guessing that the person sitting in the next pew was carrying one just like it. The town was assembling, out loud, in real time, a portrait not one of them had ever been permitted to see whole, and the man in it grew larger and gentler with every voice, until the cold stranger at the end of the road was simply gone, and in his place stood someone none of them had bothered to know, and all of them, too late, would have been proud to. Rachel stood at the pulpit and let it wash over her and over all of them. And she understood, at last, the shape that had been hidden behind the town's story. Walt had not held himself apart from the town out of coldness. Somewhere, long ago, something had happened to that man. Some grief the town had been too small to hold, and it had driven him behind those curtains. Rachel would find, later, going through his few things, a photograph, soft and worn from handling, of a young woman and a baby, and no other trace of them anywhere. And she would understand as much as she was ever going to understand, and she would let the rest be his. The town had turned a grieving man into a ghost story, and the grieving man had answered, not with bitterness, but by spending the rest of his long, silent life, quietly keeping warm and dry and whole the very town that could not find the heart to know him. He had loved them. That was the thing that filled the church that morning heavier than any grief. The man they steered their children away from had been, all along, the secret hand under half the hard winters in that town, asking for nothing, not even to be known. He did not need their thanks. He had found, it seemed, a way to belong to a place that would not let him, by loving it from the far end of a county road where no one ever had to see. Let me tell you what happened next, because with the quiet stories, the next part is the whole reason to tell them. Marjorie, from the ladies' committee, was not at the funeral, and she heard about it the way everything travels in a small town, by noon, in full. And that afternoon she came to the church, and she found Rachel still sitting in the front pew in the empty sanctuary. And she sat down beside her, this proud woman of 70, and for a while she did not say anything at all. And then she said, in a voice Rachel had not heard her use before, "We were wrong about him. For 50 years, we were wrong about him. And I helped." And Rachel, who was learning that the ministry is mostly just sitting with people while they set something heavy down, took her hand and did not say a word, because some things do not need a sermon. They only need a witness. The reception that Marjorie had not wanted to host happened after all, a week later, and Marjorie hosted it herself. And there was ham and coffee and a sheet cake, and the whole quiet town came. The working town, the old town. And they told Walt stories to each other until the light went long across the fields, filling in for one another the picture that no single one of them had ever been allowed to see whole. And the church did two things that spring that it still does. It renamed the Wednesday night supper the free one, the one that feeds anybody in the county who is hungry or lonely or just does not want to eat alone. And it carries his name now, and nobody who comes to eat is ever asked to explain why they came. And on the coldest nights of the winter, the ones where the wind comes off the plains hard enough to hurt, the church keeps its doors unlocked, and its lights on, and its heat running. A warm place, open to anyone, no questions, because a town that once left a grieving man out in the cold decided, too late for him, but not too late to matter, that it would never do such a thing again. Rachel is still the pastor there. She has been for years now. She stopped being the outsider that cold Tuesday morning, though it took her a while to notice, because the town watched their brand new pastor refuse to bury a man in a hurry. Watched her set out 9 hopeful programs in an empty church, and the town decided, quietly, in its long-memoried way, that this one they would keep. She never did get to meet Walt, but she thinks about him nearly every day, the man who taught her, before she had even properly begun, what the whole job actually is. It is to insist that a life is a life. It is to set out the programs even when you are sure no one is coming. It is to leave the light on and the door unlocked, in case, out there in the cold, there is someone the world has decided not to know, waiting to be let in. So rest now. Let the day go soft and dark and quiet. Picture a small church on the plains, with its lights on and its door unlocked against the cold. And think, if you like, of the quiet people in your own life, the ones who did the good thing and slipped away before anyone could thank them, the ones the world was too hurried to know. Somebody knew. In the end, somebody always knows. Let that be the thing you carry down into sleep tonight. The door is open, the heat is on. There is a place for everyone, even the ones we almost missed. Before you drift off, tell me one thing in the comments if you would. Who is the quiet Walt in your life? The person who did the good thing in secret and never let you pay it back? And have you ever been wrong about someone? the way that whole town was wrong, and been given the grace to find out in time? I would love to hear it, and as always, tell me where you are listening from tonight, your state, and how old you are, so I know who is out there in the dark with me. Sleep well. Leave your own light on for someone. I will see you in the next one.